January 9, 2019. Behind the guarded entrances of one of San Antonio's most exclusive neighborhoods, silence was part of the luxury. Massive homes sat behind iron gates. Security cameras watched every entrance. Residents believed they lived in a place where crime simply didn't happen. Then, shortly after 9 a.m., that illusion shattered. A frantic call reached 911. A man reported a horrifying tragedy inside his home. According to him, his girlfriend had shot her 2 young daughters before turning the gun on herself. Emergency responders rushed to the address expecting to find a devastating murder-suicide. Instead, they walked into a crime scene that would unravel one of the most chilling deceptions Texas investigators had ever encountered. Outside the mansion stood the homeowner, Charlie Wheeler. He appeared shaken, covering his face as officers approached. But experienced investigators quickly noticed something unusual. His emotions didn't seem to match the horror he claimed to have witnessed. Inside the house, officers made a heartbreaking discovery. On the second floor lay 3 victims: 37-year-old Nicole Olson, her 16-year-old daughter, Alexa, and 10-year-old London. All 3 had been shot. A handgun rested near Nicole's body, seemingly supporting the story Charlie had just told dispatchers. But detectives knew better than to accept appearances. Crime scenes don't lie. People sometimes do. As investigators carefully examined the room, several details immediately raised questions. The position of the weapon. The placement of the victims. The absence of expected evidence. Nothing felt quite right. Then something happened that completely changed the investigation. Nicole's phone lit up. It wasn't a goodbye message. It wasn't a confession. It was a routine reminder from work. A client had arrived for an upcoming salon appointment. For detectives, that single notification carried enormous weight. People planning to take their own lives rarely continue making future appointments, discussing work schedules, and preparing for the days ahead. Instead of supporting Charlie's story, the phone suggested something very different. Someone had expected Nicole to be alive. And perhaps Nicole herself had expected exactly the same thing. Investigators immediately began preserving every digital record they could find. Phone calls, emails, text messages, calendar entries. Each one painted the picture of a woman planning her future, not ending it. As detectives dug deeper, another troubling fact emerged. The gun found beside Nicole wasn't hers. It legally belonged to Charlie Wheeler. That discovery shifted the focus of the investigation almost immediately. What first appeared to be a tragic murder-suicide was beginning to look like something far more sinister. Who was telling the truth? What really happened inside that mansion? And why had the only surviving adult been so quick to provide a complete explanation before investigators had even begun asking questions? To answer those questions, detectives had to understand the relationship between Charlie Wheeler and Nicole Olson. On the surface, they seemed like an unlikely couple. Charlie came from extraordinary wealth. Nicole had spent most of her life overcoming hardship. Yet somehow their lives collided. What began as a glamorous romance would slowly transform into a relationship marked by control, fear, and isolation. Long before the gunshots echoed through that mansion, warning signs had already begun to appear. Most people simply didn't realize how dangerous those signs really were. To understand what happened inside that San Antonio mansion, investigators first needed to understand the people who lived there. Friends would later tell detectives that the relationship between Nicole Olson and Charlie Wheeler looked almost too good to be true in the beginning. But beneath the expensive vacations, luxury home, and social media photos was a very different reality. Nicole Olson had spent most of her life fighting for stability. Born in 1981, she experienced profound loss at a young age. Her father died when she was still a child, and years later she lost her mother as well. Those tragedies forced her to mature quickly and become fiercely independent. By the time she reached adulthood, Nicole was determined to provide a better life for her children than the one she had experienced. She worked long hours, often juggling multiple responsibilities just to keep food on the table. Eventually, she became a licensed cosmetologist, building a loyal clientele through years of dedication. Friends described her as warm, hardworking, and deeply devoted to her children. Her daughters, Alexa and London, were the center of her world. No matter how exhausting work became, she always made time for them. Charlie Wheeler's upbringing couldn't have been more different. He grew up in a wealthy Texas family with access to opportunities that many people could only dream about. Over the years, he became involved in business ventures connected to the oil industry and built a reputation as a successful entrepreneur. Financially, he appeared to have everything: luxury vehicles, an impressive home, a lifestyle that projected success. When Charlie first contacted Nickel through social media in 2016, he was charming and attentive. He complimented her. He listened. He made her feel seen. After months of conversation, they finally met in person. The relationship moved quickly. Charlie showered Nickel with expensive gifts, romantic trips, and promises of a better future. For a woman who had spent years struggling to support her family, the attention felt genuine. Within a relatively short time, she and her daughters moved into Charlie's sprawling home in the exclusive Anaqua Springs community. From the outside, it looked like a dream come true. But friends would later say that the changes began almost immediately. Charlie's affection slowly gave way to control. He wanted to know where Nickel was at all times. If she went out with friends, he repeatedly called and texted. If she didn't answer quickly enough, he became angry. Sometimes he demanded that her friends hand over the phones so he could question them directly. At first, Nickel brushed it off. "He's just protective," she reportedly told those closest to her. But the behavior became harder to ignore. Friends noticed bruises that Nickel tried to explain away. During one photo shoot, makeup barely concealed a dark mark beneath one of her eyes. When asked about it, she quickly changed the subject. Those closest to her sensed that something was wrong. Yet, like many victims of abusive relationships, Nickel rarely spoke openly about what was happening behind closed doors. There were also incidents that painted a troubling picture of Charlie's behavior. According to testimony presented later in court, arguments often erupted over minor issues. A misplaced object, a household chore, even insignificant accidents could trigger an outburst. Guests who visited the home described an uncomfortable atmosphere. Charlie expected complete control over the household. Nickel often appeared nervous, carefully choosing her words before speaking. One friend later recalled feeling as though Nickel wasn't living in her own home. She seemed more like a visitor, someone constantly trying to avoid upsetting the man who owned the house. Despite the wealth surrounding her, Nickel refused to give up her career. She continued working at the salon, maintaining both her financial independence and connections with people outside the home. That decision would later become critically important. It meant she had coworkers who noticed changes, friends who heard her concerns, and a support network that would eventually help investigators understand what had really been happening. By late 2018, the relationship had reached a breaking point. Unknown to Charlie, Nickel had begun making plans to leave. She quietly searched for apartments. She explored schools. She talked about creating a new life for herself and her daughters. It wasn't an emotional decision made after a single argument. It was a carefully considered escape plan. She had no idea that someone else in the house was also making plans. Only those plans would end in unimaginable violence. By the first week of January 2019, Nickel Olson had quietly reached a decision. She was leaving. Not after another argument. Not after another promise that things would change. This time, she had a real plan. According to evidence later presented in court, Nickel had begun searching for apartments weeks earlier. She wasn't simply talking about leaving, she was preparing to do it. She had contacted leasing offices, compared available units, and started making arrangements for herself and her daughters. She kept these plans mostly private. People who experience controlling relationships often do. Leaving can be the most dangerous moment. The person losing control may become desperate to regain it. Whether Charlie Wheeler knew exactly how close Nickel was to moving out became one of the central questions in the investigation. But detectives would later uncover evidence suggesting that their relationship had deteriorated significantly. Then came January 8th. To everyone who interacted with Nickel that day, she appeared focused on the future. She exchanged messages about work. She confirmed appointments with clients. She discussed upcoming schedules with coworkers. Nothing about her conversations suggested someone planning to end her life. Instead, they reflected the ordinary concerns of a busy mother balancing family and work. There was another conversation that would later become especially important. That evening, Nickel spoke with London's father. The two discussed their daughter's future, including an upcoming talent audition that London had been excited about. After talking it over, they decided it might be better to wait before pursuing the opportunity. Then London took the phone. She laughed. She talked happily with her father. There was no indication that anything was wrong inside the home. No panic. No fear. Just an ordinary conversation between a little girl and her dad. It would be the last time he ever heard her voice. Sometime during the night, tragedy struck. Exactly what happened inside the Wheeler home remains known only to the killer. By the following morning, 3 people were dead. Shortly after 9 a.m. on January 9th, Charlie Wheeler called 911. His voice sounded distressed as he reported a horrifying scene. According to Charlie, he had discovered that Nickel had shot both of her daughters before turning the gun on herself. It sounded like a tragic but familiar story. Investigators had seen murder-suicides before. But experience had also taught them one important lesson. Never accept the first version of events. Especially when it comes from the only surviving witness. When officers arrived, Charlie repeated essentially the same account. He appeared emotional. He claimed he had walked into an unimaginable nightmare. But detectives noticed something unusual. Rather than struggling to explain what had happened, Charlie seemed to have every answer ready. He immediately pointed investigators toward the conclusion he wanted them to reach. It was Nickel. She did this. Case closed. Except, real investigations don't end because someone tells police what happened. They end when the evidence agrees. And in this case, it didn't. Crime scene specialists began documenting every inch of the upstairs bedroom. Bullet trajectories. Bloodstain patterns. Shell casings. The position of each victim. The location of the firearm. Each detail was photographed before anything was touched. Almost immediately, inconsistencies began to emerge. The physical evidence wasn't aligning with Charlie's version of events. Then detectives examined Nickel's phone. One notification after another painted a completely different picture. She had work commitments, future appointments, apartment arrangements, conversations about the days ahead. These weren't the actions of someone preparing to kill her children. They were the actions of someone preparing to start over. Investigators also learned something significant about the weapon found beside her body. It wasn't registered to Nickel. It belonged to Charlie Wheeler. While that fact alone didn't prove who fired it, it made detectives question why Charlie had omitted such an important detail. The investigation quickly shifted. Instead of trying to understand why a mother would murder her children, detectives began asking a different question. What if she hadn't? As forensic specialists continued processing the mansion, prosecutors would later argue that the scene itself had been carefully staged to resemble a murder-suicide. If true, someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to shift the blame onto a woman who could no longer defend herself. The challenge now was proving it. Because suspicion alone doesn't convict anyone. Evidence does. And over the next several weeks, investigators would uncover exactly that. Digital records. Forensic science. Witness testimony. Each new discovery chipped away at Charlie Wheeler's story until the version he told on that January morning began collapsing under its own weight. What had first looked like a heartbreaking family tragedy was rapidly becoming something far more disturbing. Detectives were no longer investigating a murder-suicide. They were hunting a killer who, prosecutors believed, had been standing among them from the very beginning. As detectives left the Wheeler home that morning, they weren't convinced they had witnessed a murder-suicide. Too many questions remained unanswered. The next several weeks would be spent carefully examining every piece of evidence, interviewing witnesses, and reconstructing the final hours of Nickel Olson and her daughters. The first major breakthrough came from the people who knew Nickel best. Friends and coworkers described a woman who had been looking forward to the future. She had recently secured an apartment. She was making plans to move. She continued booking clients at the salon. She talked about upcoming events involving her daughters. Nothing suggested hopelessness. Everything suggested preparation for a new beginning. Detectives also spoke with London's father. He confirmed that he had spoken to both Nickel and his daughter the evening before the killings. The conversation had been completely normal. They discussed school, future plans, and London's excitement about opportunities ahead. There was no indication of panic. No farewell. No warning signs that anyone believed tragedy was only hours away. The more investigators learned about Nickel's final days, the less believable Charlie Wheeler's account became. Then came the forensic evidence. Crime scene specialists spent days analyzing the home, every bloodstain, every shell casing, every bullet trajectory. Every piece of physical evidence was examined in painstaking detail. Prosecutors would later argue that the scientific evidence did not support Charlie's version of events. Instead, they believed the scene had been deliberately arranged to resemble a murder-suicide. Investigators also examined Charlie's actions before and after the 911 call. Rather than focusing solely on his emotional state, detectives concentrated on facts. What time had he made calls? What had he searched online? Who had he contacted? What electronic records existed? Phones, computers, security systems, and digital communications all became critical pieces of the investigation. Unlike people, digital evidence rarely changes its story. Meanwhile, detectives uncovered testimony from friends describing a troubling pattern inside the relationship. Several witnesses recalled Charlie becoming controlling and possessive. Some described verbal humiliation. Others remembered Nickel appearing withdrawn or anxious. One friend later told investigators that Nickel had spoken about wanting to leave the relationship permanently. That statement gave investigators a possible motive. If Nickel was preparing to move out, Charlie stood to lose control over the relationship. Whether that alone explained the murders would ultimately be for a jury to decide. But detectives believed they were beginning to understand what had happened. As months passed, investigators assembled thousands of pages of reports. Forensic experts reviewed the evidence repeatedly. Prosecutors carefully evaluated whether they could prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard is important. In any criminal case, suspicion is never enough. Investigators must present evidence that convinces a jury beyond a reasonable doubt. Only after they believed that standard could be met did the case move forward. Charlie Wheeler was eventually arrested and charged with capital murder in connection with the deaths of Nickel Olson, Alexa, and London. He maintained that he was innocent. His defense challenged aspects of the investigation and argued that prosecutors had reached the wrong conclusion. As with every criminal defendant in the United States, Charlie was presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court.
The trial would become the true test of the evidence. Inside the courtroom, jurors heard testimony from investigators, forensic specialists, medical experts, friends, co-workers, and family members. The prosecution argued that Charlie had killed all three victims before attempting to stage the scene as a murder-suicide to shift blame onto Nickel. They pointed to physical evidence, witness testimony, and Nickel's documented plans for the future. The defense challenged that interpretation, questioning whether investigators had overlooked alternative explanations. Both sides presented experts. Both sides cross-examined witnesses. Ultimately, it would be 12 jurors, not public opinion, who decided which version of events the evidence supported. For the families of Nickel, Alexa, and London, the trial was about far more than legal arguments. Every day in court meant reliving unimaginable loss. Photographs, autopsy findings, recordings, text messages. Each piece of evidence reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Still, they attended because they wanted answers. And they wanted justice. As closing arguments approached, prosecutors believed they had demonstrated a clear pattern, a controlling relationship, a victim preparing to leave, a staged crime scene, and a story that, they argued, simply could not withstand the evidence. The jury was now left with one responsibility: to determine whether Charlie Wheeler's account was truthful or whether he had committed one of the most calculated acts of deception they had ever heard. More than 3 years after the killings, the case finally reached a Texas courtroom. For the families of Nickel Olson, Alexa, and London, the wait had been agonizing. Every court hearing brought back memories of the day their lives changed forever. Now, at last, a jury would hear every piece of evidence and decide Charlie Wheeler's fate. The prosecution's case rested on a simple but powerful argument. Nickel Olson was not a woman preparing to end her life. She was preparing to begin a new one. Prosecutors reminded jurors about the apartment she had secured. They pointed to the salon appointment she had already scheduled. They highlighted her conversations about future plans with her daughters. Most importantly, they argued that every action she took during her final days showed hope, not despair. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends described watching Nickel slowly withdraw from the outside world. Coworkers remembered her dedication to work despite living in luxury. Family members spoke about her love for her children. No witness described a mother who wanted to hurt them. Instead, they described someone trying to build a better future. The prosecution then shifted its focus to Charlie Wheeler. Jurors heard testimony about his controlling behavior. Witnesses described frequent arguments. Some recalled seeing injuries that Nickel had struggled to explain. Others remembered Charlie monitoring her movements and demanding to know where she was. According to prosecutors, these weren't isolated incidents. They formed a pattern of control. And when Nickel decided to leave, prosecutors argued, Charlie refused to accept losing that control. The forensic experts followed. Unlike emotional testimony, forensic science relies on measurable facts. Crime scene analysts explained how they documented the evidence inside the home. Medical experts described the victim's injuries. Firearms specialists discussed the weapon recovered at the scene. Each expert addressed a different part of the investigation. Together, prosecutors argued, the evidence pointed away from a murder-suicide and toward a staged homicide. The defense challenged those conclusions. Charlie's attorneys argued that the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence was not the only possible explanation. They questioned aspects of the forensic analysis and urged jurors not to assume guilt simply because Charlie had survived. They reminded the jury that the burden of proof rested entirely with the state of Texas. Charlie Wheeler himself maintained that he was innocent. As in every criminal trial, the jury was instructed to consider only the evidence presented in court. Speculation, emotion, and public opinion were not enough. The question before them was straightforward. Had prosecutors proven Charlie Wheeler's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt? After weeks of testimony, closing arguments finally arrived. The courtroom fell silent as both sides summarized their cases. Prosecutors argued that Charlie had carefully constructed a false narrative from the very beginning. According to them, he wasn't simply reporting a crime. He was attempting to direct investigators away from himself. The defense urged jurors to reject that conclusion. They argued that unanswered questions remained and that uncertainty should result in acquittal. Then the case went to the jury. For the families waiting outside the courtroom, every hour felt endless. Eventually, the jurors returned. The courtroom stood. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty. Charlie Wheeler was convicted of the murders. For the families of Nickel, Alexa, and London, the verdict could never undo what had happened. Nothing could bring back a mother and her 2 daughters. But it did mean that the man prosecutors said was responsible would be held accountable under the law. The judge later imposed a sentence that ensured Charlie Wheeler would spend the rest of his life behind bars. As the courtroom emptied, family members spoke about remembering the victims, not for the way they died, but for the lives they lived. Nickel was remembered as a hardworking mother, who never stopped fighting for her children. Alexa was remembered as a bright teenager with dreams still unfolding. London was remembered for her joyful personality and the excitement she had for the future. Their stories became the lasting legacy of the case. This tragedy also served as a reminder of something investigators and domestic violence advocates have said for years. Control rarely begins with violence. It often starts with isolation, monitoring phone calls, deciding who someone can spend time with, humiliating them in front of others, making them financially or emotionally dependent. These warning signs may seem small in isolation, but together they can signal a dangerous pattern. For many victims, leaving is the most dangerous point in an abusive relationship. That's why experts encourage anyone experiencing controlling or abusive behavior to seek help from trusted friends, family members, or local support organizations, whenever it is safe to do so. In the end, Charlie Wheeler's plan, if prosecutors were correct, depended on one thing. He believed the evidence would tell the story he wanted investigators to believe. Instead, the evidence told its own story. A routine work appointment, an apartment waiting to be leased, phone calls about the future, witnesses who remembered years of control, and forensic evidence that investigators said could not be ignored. One by one, those pieces came together until the picture became impossible to overlook. Behind the gates of one of San Antonio's most exclusive neighborhoods, carefully crafted lie eventually collapsed under the weight of the truth. Justice arrived far too late for Nickel, Alexa, and London.